In the early months, when Putin visited India and spoke with Modi, then traveled to China for talks with Xi Jinping, I knew how to follow these developments. I kept an eye on the oil and gas trade and tracked where the pipelines were being built. They had reached an agreement to move oil and gas from Russia, sell it to China and India, and use the proceeds to buy products from these countries to replace those they could no longer obtain from the West. Without $1 billion to do so, they made it work. Over time, it became clear, the Chinese had become the global manufacturing powerhouse, and if it's not China, it's Vietnam or Bangladesh. These countries will gladly sell to Russia, as they want that business. The Chinese, in particular, manufacture everything. Despite losing trade with Western Europe and America, Russia would not be deprived of goods. This is something many Americans fail to understand. There's nothing made in the West that they don't make better and more cheaply elsewhere. Take electric vehicles as an example. Right now, the best and most affordable electric cars and trucks in the world are made in China. China leads the world in electric vehicles and trucks, which represent the future of the automobile industry. The global transition to electric vehicles is driven not only by concerns about pollution and climate change but also by the need to economize on oil and gas. So where will countries buy these vehicles? They will buy them from China. Russia can fully re-equip its fleet by purchasing from China, using the money it earns from selling oil and gas. This revenue can power cars still running on traditional fuels, heat homes, and generate electricity. The old way of doing things no longer works. Consider Cuba, where people drive cars from the 1950s, often patched together with parts from old Jeeps. Why? Because they can't replace them. But the rest of the world isn't like that. It's as if telling Israel it can no longer practice settler colonialism. Take the American obsession with pickup trucks. To be a real man, according to American culture, you need boots, a cowboy hat, and a pickup truck. But why is that? What's inherently rugged about a pickup truck? The answer lies in the 1960s, when American car companies faced real competition for the first time in years, primarily from Europe, which had recovered from World War II. Companies like Volkswagen, Peugeot, and Fiat were rising to the challenge, knowing they had to produce better, cheaper cars to compete with the US. If they could do what Volkswagen did with the Beetle, they could capture the market because American cars at the time, like the old Chevy or the old Buick, were oversized and inefficient. The American car industry, facing this new competition, went into a financial crisis. In response, a deal was struck, resulting in a tariff. The Europeans accepted a 25% tariff on trucks, a significant cost in the car industry. This meant that any pickup truck imported from Europe would be subject to the price of the truck plus an additional 25% tariff to be paid to the US government. This made it unfeasible for European truck manufacturers, so American car companies took advantage of this. They could now produce their trucks at a higher price, with a 20% markup, but still sell them at a lower price than European trucks, factoring in the tariff. This allowed American companies to keep their profits. This is why American advertising pushed the idea of trucks as symbols of masculinity, marketing them as essential for young men seeking to impress potential partners. The marketing of trucks was more about profit than anything else, as it was a sector with better margins compared to sedans or standard vehicles. Fast forward to the present, and until 6 months ago, the US imposed a 27.5% tariff on electric vehicles, EVs, from China. President Biden recently raised it to 100%. In Europe today, 1/4 of all electric vehicles on the road are made in China. In the US, however, that number is not even close. The largest Chinese manufacturer of electric vehicles is BYD, a company few Americans may know, but it has surpassed Tesla in Europe. BYD is the leading seller of electric vehicles in Europe, not Tesla. While Tesla is also present in China, BYD dominates there. This illustrates a significant issue for the United States, which is isolating itself from the global market. In the US, there are no affordable electric vehicles because American manufacturers are charging high prices, similar to how they did with pickup trucks. The prices of electric vehicles are inflated due to tariffs and lack of competition. Meanwhile, European and Asian manufacturers don't face this issue and can offer lower-priced vehicles. For instance, A European company producing the same item as an American company would have cheaper production costs due to access to more affordable electric vehicles for logistics and operations. This discrepancy hurts American businesses that don't rely on electric vehicles because their costs are higher, and they fail to realize that they are at a disadvantage in the global marketplace. Everyone understood that Russia and China could purchase all the oil and gas that Russia could produce for the next 50 years. The question is whether we really want to develop that business. After the war in Ukraine ends, Russia might decide not to sell to Europe. Why risk that happening again? Instead, they're forming new alliances. This is why pipelines are being built. Another key point for this development is that substantial investments are being made in expanding pipelines from Russia to India and China. Some of these pipelines already existed, but many have been extended. These actions contribute to isolating the United States further. China's official ideology is socialism with Chinese characteristics, which they have embraced for many years. Interestingly, no country has ever officially called itself communist. The Soviet Union referred to itself as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, not as a communist state, even though the Communist Party led the push for socialism. The same is true for China. Mao never referred to China as communist, and neither did Lenin in Russia. Instead, they both defined their societies as socialist. Socialism, in their view, is a transition from capitalism, aiming to eventually reach communism. In Spain, the current Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, leads the Socialist Party of Spain. In France, the largest bloc in the National Assembly belongs to a group called the New Popular Front, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was originally part of the Communist Party before joining the Socialist Party and later forming his own political movement, France Unbowed. He is the de facto leader of the socialist faction in France. In many European countries, socialists and communists coexist, though they have a long history of disagreements. In French families, it is not unusual to have members who are socialists, communists, or neither, and they all might gather for a picnic together. This division is common throughout Europe. In the United States, this may be difficult for many to understand, but Europeans have been connected to socialist and communist ideologies in various ways. For example, the Paris metro is a major public transportation system that everyone uses. It has been unionized for decades, and the union is closely tied to the Communist Party. If you're an American tourist using the metro, you might not realize that the trains are driven and maintained by communists. In many European countries, socialism is a concept that is understood in a specific context. Figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US identify as socialists, and this label is accepted by them. What does it mean? It means a society where factories, offices, and stores are privately owned and operated, with a small group of employers hiring most people to work in these enterprises. However, they argue that their society isn't capitalist because they want the government to intervene to reduce the inequalities of capitalism. Capitalists, in their view, often take advantage of workers by paying them low wages, which makes life difficult for employees. Socialists, on the other hand, advocate for minimum wage laws that establish a wage floor to ensure workers are paid a fair amount. If you go below the minimum wage, there will be consequences. You can't get away with it. A recurring issue is that farmers in California often try to hire immigrants from Mexico and pay them as little as possible. This has been a point of contention for years, especially with grape farming, where boycotts have occurred in protest of poor working conditions. Wine production, which is a significant industry, also falls under this issue. However, socialists differ on how much government involvement should be involved. Some believe it's acceptable to tax corporations and the wealthy at the same rate as others, while others argue for a progressive tax system, where the wealthier individuals pay a higher percentage of their income. This would represent a greater level of government intervention. Some socialists also advocate for the establishment of agencies focused on workers' safety and health, given that companies often try to cut corners when it comes to protecting their employees from dangerous working conditions, such as excessive heat, poor air quality, or contaminated water. These socialists argue that government regulation and oversight are essential to ensure worker safety. Furthermore, there is debate within socialism about how far government intervention should go to alleviate the harshness of capitalism. Should the government provide free education to all? Should healthcare be free? For example, in France and Germany, University education is free for both undergraduate and graduate students, and this has been the case for many years. In France, when a child is born, they are covered by medical insurance from birth until death. During my time as a visiting professor at the University of Paris, I experienced the system firsthand. When I received medical care, I simply showed my card, and no payment was required. The doctors explained to me that they are salaried employees, so they don't rely on the volume of patients to generate income. The medical system in France is much more streamlined compared to the US. There are fewer administrative staff, and much of the paperwork is automated, which reduces costs. Western European socialism, as seen in countries like France and Germany, is a system where many services, including healthcare and education, are provided by the government at no cost to individuals. Bernie Sanders' proposals in the US are similar to the more generous systems in Europe. He advocates for higher taxes on billionaires, a higher minimum wage, and universal healthcare. His goal is to raise the modest levels of support in the US to the more generous levels seen in Europe. In reality, most countries fall somewhere in between, with levels of socialism that are more robust than the US but less extensive than in Western Europe. Socialism exists in many countries around the world, though the size and influence of socialist parties vary. Even in the United States, socialism has a long history, though it has always been a smaller movement. In the early 20th century, particularly in the 1910s and 1920s, socialism gained significant traction, especially with figures like Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the Railway Workers' Union and the Socialist Party. Debs even ran for president while in prison and garnered a substantial number of votes. So, when people claim that socialism can never take root in the US, it's a misinformed perspective. Eugene V. Debs was imprisoned because, as the head of the Socialist Party, he traveled across the United States during the early days of World War I without the presence of radio or television at the time. He gave speeches urging American workers not to join the war effort. He argued that the war was driven by capitalists fighting to expand their influence globally, and that no worker should be killing another worker for such reasons. His anti-war stance led to his arrest and imprisonment. Similarly, other leaders around the world responded to the outbreak of World War I with similar views. One notable figure was Vladimir Lenin, who, due to the political climate in Russia, was forced to leave the country. The alternative would have been imprisonment, so Lenin fled to Zurich, Switzerland, where he lived in exile.